united forever in friendship and labor, our mighty republics will ever endure. The great Soviet Union will live through the ages, the dream of a people, their fortress secure. Long live our Soviet motherland, built by the people's mighty hand. Long live our people, united and free, strong in a friendship tried by fire. Long may our crimson flag inspire, shining in glory for all men to see.
Very good. That was Paul Robeson, correct?
That was.
Very good.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. This is U.S. Friends of the Soviet People. The evening is August 26, 2022. We have a very special guest this evening, the one and only Grover Furr, and he will be talking about one of his books. Came out in 2019. It's Stalin, Waiting for the Truth. So he will be talking to us about that book tonight, and I'm looking forward to this very much. Just want to go over some quick rules for tonight for the audience. We are going to be taking rounds of questions throughout the night. Please keep your questions or comments to 60 to 90 seconds. That way we can address them appropriately. Second thing, if please raise your hand on the computer, or if you're on your phone, you can hit the three dots and you can go to the raise hand function. Please use that so we can keep track of all the questions in order, so we can address them that way. Third thing, just keep our questions tonight, please, relevant to the material we'll be talking about. I know there's a lot of questions that we'll probably have, but let's just be respectful of Grover's time and keep the questions relevant to the material this evening. Before I give it to Grover, Angelo, is there any comments that you'd like to make before we get going?
Yeah, I want to say hi to Grover,
Hey.
personal friend of mine.
Yeah.
Grover's, I know Grover a couple of years, fantastic. The work that Grover puts in this research, nobody else, unfortunately, has been able to do. So I want to personally say hi to him.
Hi.
This is a new format, Grover. Remember
Yes.
we used to meet in person.
Yes.
Now we have this, and we're able to reach people throughout the country now. So,
Yeah, that's right. And I understand it's going to be put online and on YouTube, and then even
exactly.
more.
Right. So we'll reach many more people than we reached before when we met in a room in New York.
Yeah, that's great.
Or California. So
It's
that's
good to-
important.
Yeah, and it's good to see you, Angelo. I'm glad that I'm glad you're doing okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad to see you too, to be honest with you. See a friendly face.
Yeah.
Okay, that's all I wanted to say. I'm no longer the head of US Friends. I'm the assistant director. Michael from South Dakota is now the new chair, and that's really good. Got new blood, Grover. New blood.
Yeah, that's very good. Wonderful.
All right. Thank you.
Wonderful. All right. Yeah, go ahead, Grover.
Okay.
And I'll give you the floor.
Thank you very much. Okay, let me just start out by saying, after much consideration, I decided not to confine my remarks just to that single book. I'm going to give more of an overview of the situation with regarding my research on the Soviet Union, and certainly I'll make some remarks about Stalin Waiting for the Truth, but I thought it was more appropriate for people who are perhaps not deeply involved with the kind of research that I'm doing to make some remarks that'll put all of this into context. So I'm going to read my paper just because it's more efficient that way. I cover the points that I want to cover, and so please bear with me while I don't look at you. I have to look down at my at my text here. All right. I call this talk the crisis of Soviet history of the Stalin period and what we should do about it. The history of the first worker state, the USSR, during its heroic period, when it was led by Joseph Stalin, that history is withheld from us. It is smothered by lies from dishonest and yet very influential sources. How do we know this is so? What is the situation? Who are the liars? Why is this important? Finally, what should we do about it? The future of the world's working class and the fight for an egalitarian world of no rich and no poor depends on what we do. I began to discuss this question in a March 2020 presentation, which is online somewhere, called Marxists Behaving Badly. That was a very partial discussion of this enormous challenge to all of us. Here, I intend to confront this crisis more directly. The anti-Stalin paradigm. What I call the anti-Stalin paradigm, or the ASP, is a special case of the anti-communist paradigm of Soviet history. In its basic formulation, the anti-communist paradigm frames the history of the last century upside down. The Western imperialist countries are supposedly democratic, free, stand for human rights. The former socialist bloc countries, especially the Stalin-era Soviet Union, were called dictatorships, totalitarian, unfree, against human rights. In reality, the opposite is the case. According to the anti-Stalin paradigm, Stalin was a bloodthirsty dictator who killed millions of Soviet citizens, engineered frame-ups against many communists, and committed innumerable crimes. This is all false. This paradigm is strictly enforced in the academic field of Soviet history, and through it into the intellectual and semi-popular media, and then into the popular mass media. According to the anti-Stalin paradigm, it is considered illegitimate, beyond the limits of respectable discussion, to disprove any crime of which Stalin has been accused. One example of this is an article by Professor Matthew Leno entitled, quote, "Did Stalin kill Kirov, and does it matter?" This is in the Journal of Modern History back in 2002. Leno insists that it doesn't matter, that Stalin did not, in fact, have Sergei Kirov killed. Why? Because Stalin was so evil that the fact that he was not guilty of killing Kirov is insignificant, according to Leno. In his 2010 book, The Kirov Murder and Soviet History, Yale University Press, Leno spends a page and a half assuring his readers that, although he himself has concluded that Stalin did not murder Kirov, he, Leno, loves freedom and democracy, hates dictatorship, so much that no one should think for a minute that he, Leno, is pro-Stalin. Something that Leno was clearly afraid of, since he was violating the unspoken rule that is nevertheless understood by all, the anti-Stalin paradigm, by concluding that Stalin did not commit this particular crime. I want to explain briefly how I came to do research on the Stalin era in the Soviet Union. My story illustrates a number of important issues that I'll discuss in more detail later. The influence of anti-communism, the need for objectivity in the search for the truth, the utter bankruptcy of the profession of Soviet history, a corruption that even the best historians of this field cannot entirely escape. In 1967, while I was watching a demonstration against the Vietnam War in Manhattan, a friend of mine remarked to me that he and I should be marching with the contingent that was passing by carrying Viet Cong flags. The Viet Cong were the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, who were combating the United States. At that moment, another onlooker told us, my friend and myself, that we should not oppose the US war in Vietnam. We asked him, why not? He replied, quote, "Because the National Liberation Front is led and controlled by the Vietnamese Communist Party. The Vietnamese Communist Party is led by Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had been trained by Joseph Stalin, and Stalin had killed 20 million people, end quote. This claim stuck in my mind. I did not believe it or disbelieve it, but I resolved that someday, when I had completed my doctoral dissertation in medieval comparative literature and had a job, I would look into this. A couple of years later, I bought and studied a copy of Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, Stalin's Purge of the 30s. I was shaken by what I read there. Page after page of accusations that Stalin had committed mass murder and other terrible crimes. So I decided that this is where I would begin to look into the accusations against Stalin and by extension against the Soviet Union of his time. I made a card file of every footnote in Conquest's mammoth book. Over a period of 3 years, I spent a lot of my spare time taking the bus from my New Jersey apartment to the New York Public Library with its magnificent Slavic collection. There, I checked Conquest's footnotes. Here's what I discovered. 1, Conquest had no primary source evidence. He took any anti-Stalin fact claimed from Khrushchev-era Soviet sources and from many other anti-communist sources, but none of these contained any evidence. 2, Conquest simply believed, that is, he proposed that his readers believe, that any statement made by virtually any writer, as long as it was hostile to Stalin, should be accepted as truthful. Not incidentally, Conquest used Leon Trotsky's autobiography, My Life, as one of his sources, and also Isaac Deutsch's flattering and dishonest biography of Trotsky. 3, Conquest's book has more than 1,000 footnotes, but many of these were to anti-communist books that were reviewed critically, even negatively, by anti-communist reviewers at the time, and none of them contained any evidence either. 4, all of the professional scholars of Soviet history who reviewed Conquest's book positively were either deceiving themselves or each other, or were genuinely ignorant of what primary source evidence was, or all of these. At that time, I did not understand that the anti-Stalin paradigm existed. I was first introduced to it in 1985. I had met a young scholar, you would recognize his name, but I'm not going to mention it here, who was one of the editors of Russian History, a scholarly journal still published today. At his suggestion, I drafted an article on the Tukhachevsky affair and sent it to him. The Tukhachevsky affair is the conspiracy of high-ranking Soviet military commanders against the Soviet government and in collaboration with the German High Command. In that article, I reviewed all the evidence that this was a frame-up by Stalin and concluded that there was no evidence to support that conclusion. The young reviewer made me rewrite the article several times and also had it vetted by other young scholars whom he knew. At last, he told me it was ready for publication. At this point, the publisher of Russian history, Charles Schlachs, rejected the article, not on academic grounds, but on the grounds that, quote, it made Stalin look good, end quote. Of course, my article did no such thing. The real reason he rejected it was that it failed to conclude that Stalin had framed Tukhachevsky and the rest. My article concluded that, quote, we just don't know. To his credit, the young scholar who had vetted my article insisted that it be published and even threatened to resign from the editorial collective if the publisher did not publish it, because it had gone through the appropriate scholarly review. So my article was published, but in a strange way. The issue in which it appeared, pardon me, contains an introduction with a commentary paragraph about each article in that issue, except for my article. The introduction simply does not mention my article at all. That is the anti-Stalin paradigm at work, only I didn't know it then. I thought this was just some quirk of this anti-communist publisher's bias. Okay, fast forward to 2005. In that year, I published a two-part article in the online peer-reviewed journal Cultural Logic, titled, quote, Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform. You may have heard of it. When it was published, a famous American Trotskyist scholar, you would recognize his name too, quit the editorial board, telling the other editors that my article should never have been published. The editors offered a refutation or criticism by him of my article, but he refused to write one and simply repeated that my article should never have been published. Fast forward to 2018, when I published my book on the Katyn massacre. In that book, I show from primary source evidence that the Soviet Union could not possibly have shot the Polish prisoners of war in this massacre. I also expose the dishonesty of the two major academic studies of Katyn. For some years, I had been a member of the H. Poland mailing list, one of the dozens of academic mailing lists run by the University of Michigan and known as the HNet lists. This list has a monthly post listing new books related to Polish history. I submitted my book to be included in this list. As a result, the moderator of the list expelled me from the list without explanation or appeal. This was in violation of the HNet guidelines, but the HNet managers refused to reinstate me on the list. My first book, Khrushchev Lied, was published in English in February 2011. It had already been published in Russian in December 2008. It sold 13,000 copies in Russian, but attracted very little attention outside of Russia. But within a year, the English edition went around the world. I still did not fully comprehend the implications of the fact that Khrushchev had told nothing but lies about Stalin in that world-shaking secret speech of February 1956. It took me some time to ask myself, why had Khrushchev told nothing but lies in that speech? Why had he not sprinkled some true crimes of Stalin in with the lies? The answer, which should have been obvious at once, is clear. Khrushchev could not find any real crimes of Stalin to include. In October 1961, Khrushchev presided over the 22nd Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev's acolytes attacked Stalin ferociously. Once again, those accusations, the ones I could check up on, thanks to documents from formerly secret Soviet archives, are all false. After the 22nd Party Congress, Khrushchev and his men did two things. First, they sponsored a flood of pseudo-historical articles and books about Stalin's alleged crimes. I have checked many of those books and articles. None of them contain any primary source evidence. In 1962, the Khrushchev regime held a conference for party historians. These were historians of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. There, Pyotr Pospelov, one of Khrushchev's cronies, told the assembled party historians they would have to refer to the Khrushchev-era textbook of party history and to the proceedings of the 22nd Party Congress. He explicitly informed them that they could not have access to documents in the Central Party Archive. The realization gradually dawned on me that the archives must not contain any evidence to support the Khrushchev-era allegations against Stalin. That in fact, they must contain evidence to disprove these allegations. The second thing Khrushchev did was to create a blue ribbon commission under the chairmanship of Nikolai Shvernik, an old Bolshevik, to find evidence that the Tukhachevsky affair defendants and the Moscow trials defendants of the 1930s were innocent. This commission wrote two lengthy reports, one in 1962-63, the other in 1964. Neither was published until 1993, after the end of the Soviet Union. In these reports, the researchers tried hard to find evidence that the military commanders and Moscow trials defenders had been framed, that they were innocent victims of Stalin. but they were unable to do so. In fact, they found some evidence to the contrary. In 1987, Mikhail Gorbachev, then the first secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, launched yet another sustained attack on Stalin. Like Khrushchev's, it was accompanied by a flood of pseudo-historical articles and books, some of them published in hundreds of thousands of copies. Gorbachev also drew upon materials from the Khrushchev era. I have studied many of the works sponsored by Gorbachev. None of them contain primary source evidence to support charges that Stalin committed any crimes. In 1988, the Soviet Supreme Court ruled that Nikolai Bukharin and a few other defendants in the third Moscow trial of March 1938, who had not yet been rehabilitated, were innocent. The document containing the Supreme Court's ruling remains classified in Russia today. In 2007, I discovered the full text of this Soviet Supreme Court ruling in the Volkogonov archive that had been exported from Russia in the early 1990s by General Dmitry Volkogonov, a ferocious enemy of Stalin and of communism, and very close associate of Gorbachev and Yeltsin. In 2010, my Moscow-based colleague Vladimir L. Bobrov and I published, in Russian, an article showing that the Soviet Supreme Court had deliberately lied in their decision. In that decision, they quote from a 1939 confession by Mikhail Frenovsky, Nikolai Yezhov's right-hand man in the NKVD, a confession that was still secret in 1988. When it was finally published in 2006, we could see that in reality, Frenovsky testified that Bukharin was not innocent, but guilty. All this raises the question, what is evidence? Many people, including many who consider themselves to be on the left, resemble the followers of Donald Trump in that they don't care about evidence. What they want is material that reinforces whatever their preconceived ideas and biases already are. Persons who think this way are not interested in the truth. So what is evidence? Primary source evidence, usually, though not always, documents, is the only valid evidence. But what then is primary source evidence? It is evidence that is as close to the matter that you are investigating as you can get. Such evidence will be biased since, like all evidence, it is created by human beings, and we all have biases. But it will only reflect the biases of its own time and place, as close to the matter under investigation as possible. I learned about primary source evidence from studying medieval literary history for my doctoral degree. I was fortunate to have an iconoclastic professor of medieval literature named Robertson. He had first shaken and then changed forever the whole academic field by insisting on studying primary source evidence, often in Latin, to explain the allegorical meaning of the poetry of Geoffrey Chaucer and others. Robertson was insulted at academic conventions, but he stuck to his guns. He taught all of us, his graduate students, to rely on primary sources. Quote, "Academia is very faddish," he told us. "Don't hesitate to read the evidence and make up your own mind, even if it contradicts everything the experts in the field have written," end quote. That's what he did, and that's what he demanded of us. This experience was liberating for many of us graduate students. We came to apply it to the American propaganda about the Vietnam War that we read in the New York Times and saw on television. Some of us became active in the anti-war movement and in SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and began to study Marxism and communism. My department chairman, the famous translator Robert Fagles, once told another graduate student and me this story. Quote, said Fagles, "Robertson once asked me, 'Why are there so many Marxists in your department?' I told him, 'Robbie, it's because of you.' And in a way, he was right, because once you begin insisting on primary source evidence, it changes the way you think about everything. Primary source evidence does not have the bias of later periods. So, for example, primary source evidence produced in the 1930s is close to the Moscow trials. But statements, confessions, and so forth about the Moscow trials produced during Nikita Khrushchev's time, 1956 to 64, is not primary source evidence, because those statements will inevitably reflect the biases of Khrushchev's time. And in fact, we know that Khrushchev was soliciting false testimony against Stalin, just as Gorbachev did later, again, on an even larger scale. Let me put it plainly, again, with an example. For many years, the only primary source evidence we had about the Moscow trials of 1936 to 38 was the trial transcripts themselves. All the evidence in these transcripts points towards the guilt of the accused. Many people at the time and since denied that the accused were guilty, but they had no evidence that the Moscow trials were frame-ups. The only primary source evidence available was that of the trials transcripts. Therefore, since the only primary source evidence available pointed unequivocally towards the guilt of the defendants, no one, either at that time or since, was or is justified in drawing any other conclusion except this: on the evidence, the Moscow trials defendants were guilty. Or take the accusation that Leon Trotsky collaborated with the Nazis. We have a great deal of evidence that Trotsky collaborated with the Nazis and the Japanese and engaged in other crimes. We have no objective evidence that this evidence against Trotsky was fabricated or faked. Therefore, an objective assessment must be this: in light of the fact that all the evidence we now have points to Trotsky's guilt, objectivity demands that we conclude that Trotsky was guilty. If in future more primary source evidence is discovered that contradicts this conclusion, we must be ready to revise our judgment or even to reverse it. That is, assuming we are interested in the truth. Trotsky, of course, denied his guilt. But to a serious seeker for historical truth, Trotsky's denials are of no interest. Why? Because we expect that both the guilty and the innocent will claim that they are innocent. There has never been any evidence that the Moscow trials were frame-ups. On the contrary, all the primary source evidence points towards the guilt of the defendants. And now, from the former Soviet archives, we have an enormous amount of more primary source evidence of the guilt of the Moscow trials defendants. So there can be no doubt about it. The Moscow trials defendants were guilty of at least those crimes to which they confessed themselves guilty. Leon Trotsky did indeed collaborate with the Nazis, among committing other serious crimes. Yet, a great many people believe that the Moscow trials defendants were innocent, framed by Stalin and the prosecution. They believe this in defiance of all the primary source evidence. They believe this because they do not understand what evidence is or how to use it. Also, because they are accustomed to accepting the word of the academic experts in many fields. So why not accept the word of academic experts in the field of Soviet history? But there are other barriers to discovering the truth. Objectivity. Now I am going to read to you a longish quotation from one of my books. In my book, Leon Trotsky's Collaboration with Germany and Japan, which I published in 2017, I write as follows, quote, identifying, locating, gathering, and even studying and interpreting evidence are skills that can be taught to anyone. The most difficult and unfortunately all too rare skill in historical research is the discipline of objectivity. In order to reach true conclusions, statements that are more truthful than other possible statements about a given matter, a researcher must first question and subject to doubt any preconceived ideas she may hold about the subject matter under investigation. It is one's own preconceived ideas and prejudices that are most likely to sway one into a subjective interpretation of the evidence. Therefore, the researcher must take special steps to make certain that this does not happen. This can be done. The techniques are known and widely practiced in the physical and social sciences. They can be adapted to historical research as well. If such techniques are not practiced, the historian will inevitably be seriously swayed from an objective understanding of the evidence by her own pre-existing preferences and biases. That will all but guarantee that her conclusions are false, even if she is in possession of the best evidence and all the skills necessary to analyze it. Nowhere is a devotion to objectivity more essential or less practiced than in the field of Soviet history of the Stalin period. As it is impossible to discover the truth absent a dedication to objectivity, this study, my book, strives to be objective. Its conclusions will displease, even outrage, a good many persons who are dedicated not to objectivity and the truth, but to protecting the legend of Trotsky as an honorable revolutionary, or to defending the Cold War anti-communist paradigm of Soviet history, end quote. Media historian Michael Schudson has correctly called objectivity, quote, an ideology of the distrust of the self, end quote. In order to put it into effect, to operationalize objectivity, therefore, we must lean over backwards, as it were. That is, make a sincere, determined, diligent attempt to minimize our own pre-existing biases and preconceived ideas. We must look with extra skepticism at any evidence or any account that tends to support our own bias. At the same time, we must give an especially generous, sympathetic consideration to any evidence that tends to contradict our own bias. If we fail to do this, we will inevitably fall prey to confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to regard with sympathy materials that support our own bias and to regard skeptically or even to reject evidence that tends to disprove our bias. If we do this, and this is by far the normal practice in the field of Soviet history of the Stalin period, not only will we never discover the truth, being blinded by our own bias, we will not even recognize the truth if by chance we happen to run across it. Bias can be overt or hidden, covert. The former is relatively easy to recognize. Most historiography of the Stalin period, to say nothing of media accounts, reeks of overt bias. When you are confronted by overt bias, you can safely ignore what is being said or what you are reading. There is no chance that it will be a truthful account. Why? Because the author has not practiced objectivity. This disqualifies all the most famous academic so-called experts in Soviet history, all of them. It also disqualifies anything published by, for example, the Hoover Institution, as well as any book or article published by a fellow of the Hoover, like Conquest was or Stephen Kotkin is. Why? Because the Hoover is the largest and best funded academic research institution in the world, anti-communist academic research institution in the world. It never, ever publishes anything that could be construed as pro-communist or pro-Stalin. Therefore, there is no chance that it will publish the truth. By the same token, you should also discount anything published by an avowed Trotskyist. A Trotskyist historian has no incentive to tell the truth. He or she is constrained to come to anti-Stalin conclusions and support pro-Trotsky accounts, and so is not interested in questioning his own bias, that is, in being objective. Therefore, a Trotskyist historian can never come to truthful conclusions concerning the Stalin-era Soviet Union. History is not like a court trial. Persons who do not understand how essential objectivity is often confuse themselves and others by claiming that, for example, Leon Trotsky must be, quote, declared innocent because, quote, there is no defense attorney, or Trotsky's guilt is not, quote, beyond a reasonable doubt. This is all wrong. In historical research, there is no such thing as a presumption of innocence. There is no prosecutor. There is no defense attorney. There is no doctrine such as guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Why? Because no one is on trial. No one's freedom or life is at stake. And the case can be reopened at any time if new evidence comes to light. In fact, this is precisely what has happened through the publication of documents from former Soviet archives. The primary source evidence, this primary source evidence allows us to discover the truth about many events and alleged events of Soviet history of the Stalin period. A word about the use of Soviet evidence. You sometimes hear the claim that, quote, Soviet evidence is tainted evidence. This is false. Soviet primary sources are as useful as evidence as any other primary sources. Moreover, anti-Stalin and pro-Trotsky writers use Soviet evidence all the time. The late Vadim Z. Rogovin, the most famous Trotskyist historian of the Stalin period, cited Soviet sources hundreds of times in his numerous books. It is invalid to argue that Soviet evidence should be rejected when it tends, for example, to show that Trotsky was guilty of serious crimes and conspiracies, but acceptable when it tends to show that Stalin was guilty of this or that crime. It is also invalid to argue, as many Trotskyists and anti-communists do, that, quote, Trotsky must be innocent of collaborating with the Germans because no evidence of this collaboration has turned up in the captured German archives, end quote. I have discussed this argument in detail in several of my books and in at least 3 of my podcasts. See, for example, my book, New Evidence of Trotsky's Collaboration, published in 2020, on pages 22 to 24, for an extended discussion of this point. The bottom line is this. It is invalid to declare that Trotsky was innocent of collaboration with the Nazis because of evidence that is lacking, while ignoring that large amount of evidence that Trotsky's guilt that exists. A scientific principle states that, quote, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We must work with the evidence we have. In the case of Trotsky's collaboration with Germany and Japan, we have a great deal of it. Many dishonest writers rely on the fact that most of their readers do not know what evidence is or how to understand it. Okay, this applies to all of us, right? This is not surprising. Most people do not work with historical evidence and do not do historical research. So why would we expect that they should know what evidence is, what it is not, and how to use it? And sure enough, they don't know. But many college-educated people assume that somehow they do know how to use and evaluate historical evidence, even though they have never given this question any serious thought and had never been trained in using it. Such persons are especially easy to fool with fallacious arguments. Ignorance of logical fallacies. One aspect of the general ignorance about how to identify and use primary source evidence is the general ignorance of logical fallacies, that is, errors in informal logic. Here are some of the most common fallacies that I see all the time in persons who write me, as well as in persons who criticize my work, and also in the work of anti-communist scholars. Confirmation bias, I've already spoken about that. Ad hominem argument, for example, name calling. Grover Furr is a Stalinist, there you go, all right? That's an ad hominem argument. Appeal to authority. All of these famous people, they must be right. Begging the question, that is, assuming that which is to be proven. Argument from incredulity. That runs something like this. I can't believe that, therefore it isn't true, or therefore it is less likely to be true. Argument from repetition. You hear a fact claim so often from so many different sources that you feel there must be at least some truth in it, or, quote, where there's smoke, there's fire. That's a fallacy. Association fallacy. Grover Furr is a Stalinist. That's also an example of an ad hominem argument, name calling. So there's no need to read his research because Stalinists are wrong. Guilt by association is another version of this. Argument from motive. Quote, Furr wants to find Stalin blameless of any crime, therefore you could dismiss whatever he says. Bandwagon. All the experts say it. That's appeal to authority too. So we can be pretty sure it's true.
Grover,
Red
let's
herring.
maybe go a couple more minutes and then we'll break for questions, okay?
Certainly.
Okay.
Red herring. In the first Moscow trial, defendant Goldsman, how are we doing? Okay. Defendant Goldsman claimed that in November 1932, he met Trotsky's son, Leon Sedov, in a Copenhagen hotel and then went to visit Trotsky. The red herring is the evidence that he could not have met Sedov since Sedov was not there, but that doesn't mean that he didn't meet Trotsky there. Shifting the burden of proof. It's up to Furr or whoever to explain why there's no evidence of Trotsky's conspiracy with the Germans and Japanese in the German and Japanese archives, instead of dealing with the mountains of Soviet evidence that Trotsky did collaborate. And finally, argument from consequences. If Furr is correct that Trotsky collaborated with the Germans and Japanese, that the whole Trotskyist movement for the past 90 years is a delusion, and that would be so often that it just can't be true. Okay. I'm going to wrap it up in another minute or two. Why do most people think that Stalin was a criminal? The short answer is for the same reason that most people think communism is bad and the communist movement was bad. Anti-communist, anti-Stalin propaganda. After the Russian Revolution, the field of Soviet studies was established mainly to provide ammunition in the form of academic sounding falsehoods to political anti-communism. It was never primarily about discovering the truth about the Soviet Union. Leon Trotsky's lies about Stalin, and they are lies, as I've shown in several books, I've written 4 books on Trotsky now, had a limited, though important, circulation on the non-communist and anti-communist left. The Cold War caused an increase in the anti-communist propaganda, but Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech to the 20th Party Congress in February 1956 was a body blow to the world communist movement from which it never recovered. In it, Khrushchev described Stalin as a criminal, much as Trotsky had done. And of course, I wrote a book about that. Let me just conclude. I'll just hop ahead here. So the big lie works, and that's the big lie. Propaganda works. The importance of these facts. The question of Stalin is the most important question facing workers, students, and intellectuals worldwide who are striving to get rid of capitalism or to reform it, or even to reform it. The big lie is that Joseph Stalin was a mass murderer who framed on false charges and killed a great many loyal communists and many millions of Soviet citizens. The big lie is not only taken for granted as true, it's taboo to question it. The experts all claim that Stalin was a mass murderer. The media cannot and do not do independent research on their own. They're not equipped to do it, so they repeat what the experts say. This is the kind of stuff we are all facing. It's important that we all understand that we are under attack by the lies against Stalin. What should we do? It's up to us to counter them through study, through spreading the word, social media, articles, letters to the editor, publications. Remember the world's greatest expert on Stalin and the Soviet Union during his time, Stephen Kotkin of Princeton University and the Hoover Institution, wrote a book in which every single allegation of crime or even minor misdeed of Stalin is provably, demonstrably false, every single one. I demonstrate this thoroughly in my book, Stalin Waiting for the Truth, the one that Michael gestured towards. If Kotkin could not find even a single real provable crime of Stalin, it has to be because, like Khrushchev, he couldn't find evidence of even one of them. So in order not to violate the anti-Stalin paradigm, he had to falsify and lie. I have some more remarks, but at this point, would you like to pause so there can be some Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go
Okay.
ahead and do that. So if anybody does have a question, please feel free to raise your hand. We'll go down the list. And again, just a reminder, keep your questions or comments to 60 or 90 seconds. That way we can get through as many as possible. So first, we'll start with Andrea, Canada.
Hello. Thank you for being here, first of all. It's sort of a comment question. It's really quick, kind of general, but especially relating to now. Do you think there is some specific thing or movement or whisper that got all this? Like, why this extreme hate on Stalin? I know Lenin took heat, especially from anarchists, but did he get this much as well? Like, basically, yeah.
Okay.
Why all the focus on Stalin? Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Briefly, just think about it. The Soviet Union and the world communist movement performed miracles. I don't want to enumerate them all because it would take a while, but they performed miracles in not only industrializing the Soviet Union and providing unheard of benefits to the population, fighting off Hitler, being the mainstay, the main force fighting colonialism by the imperialist countries. They performed. The Soviet Union was set an example of anti-racism. The communist movement did perform such miracles that the capitalists and imperialists just have to make it look bad. They have to make it look terrible. Okay, they have to make it look like no matter how bad capitalism is, communism is worse. So in brief, I think that motivates it. That's the main reason why there's all of this focus on Stalin. And of course, the fact that the field of Soviet history of the Stalin period is dominated by this anti-Stalin paradigm. So all of the legitimated experts are required to support this notion that Stalin was a great criminal. In fact, Stalin was not only not a criminal, Stalin wasn't a dictator. In another talk, with other evidence, I demonstrate that too. There's no evidence that Stalin was a dictator, just like there's no evidence that he ever had anybody killed. But you can't say that. And therefore, of course, it gets into the mass media and the semi-popular press. And if you point out, as I do, that these statements are all false, you're treated with incredulity. How could all of these legitimated experts be wrong? But I think it's because of the great achievements of the communist movement of the 20th century.
Okay, thank you for that question, Andrea. Next, we'll go to Vlad, California. You have the floor.
Hi, Grover Furr. My name is Vlad. I'm actually an immigrant from Russia.
Great.
I highly admire your work.
Great.
I'm an aspiring historian myself, and I just have a question, quick question.
Sure.
What advice would you have for a person with communist views seeking to be a historian like yourself? Thank you.
Well, don't try to get a job teaching Russian history, because unless you are anti-communist, with the Trotskyists as an exception, of course, unless you're an anti-communist, you're simply not going to be able to have a career in Soviet history, because you have to attack Stalin and attack the Soviet Union, and you have to do those things. That's required. That's what the anti-Stalin paradigm is. And I can do this because I teach medieval literature. My career doesn't depend upon being acceptable to mainstream anti-communist academia, but if I were to try to teach Soviet history, I certainly wouldn't be able to do that. Anybody, it's just not permitted. So I would say, yes, persevere in studying the history, but don't think you're going to get a job teaching Soviet history or Russian history. That's not going to happen. Or if it does, you'll have to, falsify your views. I would say do it in your spare time.
All right, thank you for that question. Next, we have Stephen from Arkansas.
Yes, hello, Dr. Grover Furr. I just wanted to say, I'm here writing notes for U.S. Friends of the Soviet People Southern Chapter, and I wanted to ask you if there's one thing you want me to bring home to my little group, what would it be?
One thing?
What's the most important thing?
Evidence. I have a little thing that I say to my students, so this is a good time to pop it out here too. In all my classes, and I don't teach Soviet history, I don't teach Russian history, I teach medieval literature and other literatures. But at some point or other in all my classes, I ask my students, what's the most radical word in the English language? And some of them, some of them they say all kinds of things. Some of them say socialism, some of them say communism. And I always reply, well, socialism and communism are good radical words, but I got a word that's even more radical, and that word is evidence. If you ask for evidence, always ask for evidence, you will not only eventually be called a communist, you will eventually be called a Stalinist, as I am called, because the evidence that Stalin committed these crimes isn't there. So, evidence.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, we have Xavier, Oregon. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you. And also Cameron is here with me and she has a question as well. So first off, I just wanted to say, Mr. Furr, that I am a huge fan of your work. Yeah, you were a big influence to me as well, in order to just kind of unlearn a lot of the anti-Stalin propaganda. And I do think that what you're saying is accurate about the anti-Stalin paradigm. And I thought it was interesting how one of the early people who you had referenced early on in this presentation had said that Stalin killed 20 million people. It seems like they keep raising the number year after year. The most recent figure I heard was 100 million. But anyways, I was wondering if you had any, next, be quiet. I was wondering if you had any suggestions on when people kind of get caught into this loop of you can't contradict anything that says Stalin is wrong because Stalin is bad. Is there like a good way to kind of break through that barrier of communication?
Well, the only way to do it, I'm sorry to sound like a broken record if that's what if I do. The only way is to say, what's the evidence? What is it? I get questions all the time from people, mainly by email, asking me, questions such as you suggest. And it always boils down to look for the evidence. People basically believe the propaganda that they hear in the mass media, and the more informed among them believe the propaganda that they read in the scholarly research, so-called scholarly research by the legitimated experts. But they don't have the evidence. This is what I've discovered years ago by beginning to study Robert Conquest's book. And then when I wrote that article on the Tukhachevsky affair back in the 80s, and the publisher didn't want to publish it. Okay. I said there's just no evidence. Now, of course, my colleagues and I have published a book in 2021, that it's called Trotsky and the Military Conspiracy, where we have an enormous amount of evidence that the Tukhachevsky conspirators were in fact guilty as charged, and that they were conspiring with Trotsky, and that Trotsky was guilty too. And we have an English translation, the only translation of the entire transcript of the trial of the Tukhachevsky defendants. It was silently declassified in 2018. And my colleague Sven Erik Holmstrom translated it into English, and we publish it as an appendix in that book. So we have tons of evidence, but of course, in legitimated academic circles, you can't say that. You just can't say that Tukhachevsky was innocent, regardless of your evidence. Likewise with the Katyn massacre. Likewise with the Moscow trials. You can't say that Stalin was innocent, regardless of what the evidence says.
Great, thank you. And I just want to mention it is 9:30. I noticed we do have quite a few hands.
Sure, go
Please
ahead.
let's just keep it brief. That way we can
Sure.
have Grover on his way. So Cameron, go ahead.
Yeah, first off, I want to say what I heard from you tonight was incredibly insightful. I've heard of you before, but have only kind of skimmed over your work. So it was really nice to hear what you had told us. My question is, one of the supposed crimes that I've heard about, especially on social media, is like a Stalin persecution of homosexuals in the Soviet Union. Is that something you've run across, and is that something that you've had to counter?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a very good question. I don't think Stalin had anything to do with it, but the Soviet Union came out of a capitalist society, and the medical professionals who remained in Russia were trained under Tsarism, and they followed the lead of Western Europe, mainly Western European medical science and psychology. And at that time, homosexuality was viewed by the medical profession in the West as some kind of aberration or illness. And the Soviet doctors followed their Western colleagues in that. And Soviet medicine was more widely, medical care was of course much more widely available to Soviet citizens and so forth, but medical and particularly psychological views were taken by Soviet doctors from Western European sciences. So the Soviets followed the Western European what the Western European scientists said, and of course American scientists. Throughout the capitalist world, homosexuality was viewed as abnormal, as an aberration, was outlawed, and so forth and so on. So the Soviets did not break from that tradition.
Great, thank you for that question. Next, we'll go to Shelley.
Hi, Dr. Furr. It's very much an honor to hear you speak tonight. You were talking about objective history and talking about if you do history objectively, no one's life is really at stake.
Yep.
And I think maybe the one comment that I would have to say is that I feel like the question of Stalin and the Soviet Union and the miracle economically the Soviet Union performed under Stalin is a direct threat to the capitalist system as a whole.
Yes.
Especially because I think out of any of the Marxist writers, theoretical writers, Stalin is the most clear and easy to read. Do you think that has anything to do with kind of the scare campaign against Stalin, just to obscure how easy it is for any kind of normal person to kind of pick up his writings and actually really mark with them? Thank you.
Sure, that's a very good point. Yeah, I think in all of the anti-Stalin propaganda that we're subjected to discourages people from reading the primary sources like Stalin's works or like the transcripts of the Moscow trials. Most people have never read them. They're 1,600 pages long. And of course, it's not just a question of reading them, you have to study them. And I have done that. I wrote a book about them. But yes, I think that's right. We are trained to repeat what the experts tell us. And in the case of Soviet history, the experts are completely unreliable. 20 years ago, there was a historian of American history named Michael Belsiles, who was dismissed from his tenured position at Emory University because he had either fabricated or at least seriously fudged some evidence in one of the books he wrote. For doing the same kind of thing in Soviet history, historians are rewarded. Okay, so there's a big difference there.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you for that. Next, we'll go to Jake, Missouri.
So I'm very familiar with your books. I just heard you say that you have a podcast. Could you please tell us what that is? Because I'm very
I
interested
don't
in
know.
listening to it.
Yeah, I don't know what it is. If you go to YouTube, this is what I do. You go to YouTube and you put in my name, a number of podcasts will come up. I don't remember precisely which one has those statements in it that I mentioned to you. I'm sorry, I don't recall. I might be able to dig it up, but there are. I've given a number of talks, somewhat similar to what I'm doing tonight, and a number of these have been made into not podcasts, right? YouTube presentations. So I'm sorry, I can't identify the specific one that you asked about.
All right. Thank you for that. Next, we'll go to Naveen.
Hello, Dr. Furr.
Hi.
I'm just a quick question. So I'm interested in kind of doing some more research on some of the Moscow trial. I found actually that you translated some of these from Russian into English. So my question to you is, do you have any sources in English, preferably either translated or whatever, where I can learn more about this?
I wrote a book called The Moscow Trials as Evidence. So I would start there.
Okay.
Just deals with this question of evidence. I mean, it's unless you're used to this, as I have become used to it, it's shocking to many people the extent to which professional historians of the Soviet Union simply lie about it, or maybe they avert their eyes. Maybe they choose not to look at the evidence because they're afraid of what they might find. Kind of like the Emperor's New Clothes. Remember that Hans Christian Andersen story, right? So there's a tremendous amount of evidence that the Moscow trials defendants were guilty. If you take a look at that book, The Moscow Trials as Evidence, you'll see quite a lot of it. Nevertheless, it is simply taboo to mention in the field of Soviet history that the Moscow trials defendants were guilty. You can't do that. You can't say that.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Next, we have Christian, California.
Yes, good evening, sir, and I'm very honored to see you and to listen to you today. I have a few questions. The first one is, okay, we all know that Khrushchev opened a breach in a fortress, with this anti-Stalin thing in 56, okay? Then Gorbachev in 87, they went after Stalin and they ended up going after Lenin, especially Gorbachev, okay?
Yes.
But what we see now, as in for the last maybe 7-8 years or so, specifically since 2014, is Stalin is being rehabilitated in Russia.
Mm-hmm.
For example, Volgograd is renamed Stalingrad one day a year, and I wouldn't be surprised that he retrieves the name of Stalingrad. Okay, and movies about Stalin are so famous in Russia right now. Everything is rehabilitating Stalin. What is your opinion about this? Second, other question is, I've read the books of Geoffrey Roberts and Carly, and they're not so bad. And I was thinking, what is your opinion on those two? And
Roberts and who? Who else?
Geoffrey Roberts and Michael Carly, the one who wrote 1939.
Oh, Carly, yeah, Carly. Okay.
Carly, from Canada, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, and I've read the things
60 seconds.
And what you think about this. The Diary of Georgy Dimitrov is fascinating, and also the Molotov Remembers. And tell me what you think about those two.
That's 4 books. Roberts and Carly are good, but they're in the mainstream, so they don't go beyond a certain point. And that's true of many historians in the Soviet field. If you concentrate on one particular question, and particularly World War II, okay, Roberts and Carly are pretty good on World War II, on the run up to World War II. And they have been criticized by some of the they sort of define the limits of acceptable opinion about Soviet history. But I have corresponded with both of them, and both of them insist that the Soviets killed the Polish prisoners of war at Katyn. Roberts told me, well, that's what the evidence shows. Well, that's not what the evidence shows. It's perfectly clear that he hasn't ever looked at the evidence. But I think that he understands, and Carly too. Carly was actually quite nasty to me when I pointed that out to him. But you can't say that. You can say, thanks to them, you can say, well, the Soviets were really tried to have collective security against Hitler, and the British and the French wouldn't have it, so that in many respects, World War II was the fault of the British and the French, as well, of course, as of Hitler, and certainly not of the Soviet Union. That they say that, and they are within the limits, maybe just barely, of respectable opinion. But you can't go much beyond that. And you certainly can't say things like the Moscow trials defendants were innocent, or that Stalin didn't kill millions of people, or that the Soviets didn't commit the Katyn massacre. And as for popularity of Stalin in Russia, sure. Stalin is praised for two reasons, in my estimation and my observation. One is nationalism, right? The Soviet Union, the biggest part of which was Russia, was strong and powerful and respected worldwide. And Stalin built up the economy, and prices for basic foodstuffs and other necessities were supported and going down. And I think it's widely understood in Russia that Khrushchev started the rot that ended up in the end of the Soviet Union. The 1990s in Russia were a period when the life expectancy dropped precipitously. It was a terrible, terrible period. When the Soviet Union came to an end, it was a terrible disaster for most people in the Soviet Union. So I think that for the most part, it's a kind of longing for the past, glories, and often that's identified with Stalin. Now, of course, unlike all of the other Eastern European countries, there is a sizable communist, pro-communist sentiment among many, many people in Russia. So that obviously that's some of that too. And of course, a lot of it is World War II. Okay, briefly, that's what I got to say. Go ahead.
All right, thanks for that question. We have time for about one more.
Well, sure. Go ahead.
Yep, so we'll do David Oregon.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask, one thing that I hear gets tossed around a lot is that Stalin was trying to start another Holocaust with the Doctor's Plot. I was wondering if you, you all know what actually happened there.
Yes. Okay, in my book, I try to think about how to answer this briefly. In my book, Blood Lies, which is a refutation of Timothy Snyder's book, Bloodlands, at the very end of one of the last chapters, I go through some of the accusations that Snyder and, of course, others make that Stalin was anti-Semitic, and show that that's not the case. And I write a little bit about the Doctor's Plot there. Now, I'm giving you the short version here. There's a little bit more to it, because there were one or two serious anti-Semites, in my opinion, in the MVD, the successor to the NKGB, and they were dealt with, but a little bit later on. However, this was not Stalin's doing. If you read his daughter's memoirs, and of course, you have to take everything that Svetlana Alliluyeva says with a grain of salt, for reasons that we don't have time to go into now.
Yeah.
But one of the things he says is that her father's housekeeper told her, Svetlana, Stalin's daughter, that Stalin had told her, the housekeeper, that he didn't believe the charges against the doctors.
Oh.
So, and I, you know, but read what I have to say there at the end of at the last chapter of Blood Lies, and you know, obviously this is too short. They certainly, well, read what I got to say. I really can't. We really don't have time for me to go into any more detail. But read that. The Medvedev brothers, one of whom is now dead, but the other of whom is alive at the age of about 96, wrote a book. Wrote many books. They wrote a book of some years ago where they said that the doctor's plot suddenly stopped appearing in Pravda at the beginning of March 1953. And in their opinion, and these people hated Stalin, these are the Medvedev brothers, Jorez and Roy Medvedev, they hated Stalin. In their opinion, only Stalin had the authority to tell the editors of Pravda to stop running stories about the doctor's plot. So the doctor's plot was certainly, you know, I don't have time to go into it, but there certainly was, by the way, I just want to say this. If you read what I have to say at the end of Blood Lies, there certainly was some sort of doctor's conspiracy around the death of Andrei Zhdanov. And we know that because even after the doctors who were involved in Zhdanov's mistreatment were cleared by the courts, they turned around and admitted it. They said, yeah, we all got together and decided that Zhdanov could get up and walk around and so forth and so on, and that he didn't really have a serious heart condition. But we didn't do this because we wanted to cause him harm. We did it because we made a mistake. But there certainly was a kind of conspiracy. Anyway, a kind of conspiracy. Anyway, in brief, take a look at what I wrote there. I guess I can certainly. Okay, it's only 9:45. Let's give it another 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Is everyone okay with that? Anyone have any
5 more minutes, and then I do have to. Then I will have to go.
Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you so much. So we'll go down the list. Then we'll go to Alexander, Alaska. Go ahead.
Hello, Professor.
Hi.
I just want to mention that I remember reading it through Kotkin's Facebook on Stalin.
Yeah.
And I always was kind of found it funny how he admired Admiral Kolchak and General Denkin a lot more than the communist parties. I thought that was always kind of a weird thing for a historian to be in favor of, considering their historical circumstances. Anyways, my question is that on the Civil War of the Russian period, do you have any recommendations on books or sources to look through?
The Civil War has never been, well, of course, there's a library of stuff on the Civil War. I don't know of any really good works in English. There are some, there are some fairly lengthy books in English. Mostly the accounts of the Civil War deal with the clash of the armies, okay? They deal with the Civil War as though it were, it could be dealt with adequately by dealing with the battles. And of course, that's obviously a very important part of the Civil War. What it doesn't deal with is the kind of thing that we see in the American Revolution or the American Civil War on the border states. That is to say, the hostility among the different classes, among the people in the country. There was tremendous anger and hostility. There was the mobilization of people on one side or the other, neighbor against neighbor, class warfare, a hatred of peasants with the kulaks, hatred of the peasants of the landlords. The social aspect of the Civil War has not, to my knowledge, been adequately dealt with. And it isn't a period that I have spent any time in study, any special time in studying. It's really a kind of a bottomless pit that I try to stay away from, the give and the take of that. The only thing I would say is I would caution you against writers who write about this, quote, Red Terror during the Civil War. I did spend a little while a few years ago looking around for evidence of the Red Terror. Evidence, okay, not allegations, and I never found any. So that's sometimes glibly stated that there was this Red Terror during the Civil War. But other than that, the social aspect of it, the kind of thing that you read about, bloody Kansas and during the border states in the American Civil War, where the neighbors were really going out there and cutting each other's throats and all this kind of stuff. You don't get that, but there was a tremendous amount of hostility among the population in the Civil War too, and that's very important because it doesn't all go away. It doesn't all go away when the end of the Civil War comes. I mean, I read one some years ago, I read one Russian account of this saying that, if the Bolsheviks actually went around to every village and town in Russia and punished everybody who had taken some sort of retribution against their neighbors, there wouldn't be anybody left. They just had to stop doing that. They just had to, at a certain point, just try to move on, move ahead. That was the kind of internecine struggle and hatred there was during the Civil War.
Wonderful. Thank you for that question. It is 9:50 now. Angela,
Okay.
did you want to say something very brief before we end the presentation for tonight? Oh, you're muted, Angela, here.
I wanted to mention if Grover knew anything or came across any information about the Jewish Autonomous Republic of
Sure.
Azerbaijan.
Sure.
And,
Well, yes.
and how Stalin and Lenin were responsible for that.
Yeah, it was mainly, yeah. I mean, it was early on, and I don't think that it was primarily Stalin, but there are some. Let me just say this: the Soviets couldn't get Jews in any significant numbers to move to Azerbaijan, the Jewish Autonomous Republic, and that I think that's been passed over too easily. I think that's a big problem. I think I'm inclined to think that the category of nationality does not apply well to the Jews in the Soviet Union, that they were not really a nationality. And it's disturbing how many after World War II, of course, you had the Holocaust, you had a different situation, how many Soviet Jews and other Jews were quite ready to move to Palestine, to Israel, and displace the residents who are already there. If they had been really willing to move to Azerbaijan, they wouldn't have had to displace anybody, So I would just end up saying that that the people who write about Azerbaijan basically do so from a kind of Zionist bias, at least the ones that I have read, and I think the fact that not very many Jews moved to Azerbaijan, although some did and some are still there, just shows that the category of Jews as a nationality did not fit Soviet Jews for the most part very well. I don't know if that's helpful, Angela, but that's about all I can say about it.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I want to thank you all for hosting this session, and I look forward to speaking with you again sometime, I hope, and I hope that you will email me the link when it gets up on YouTube, and we'll all share this link with our friends who could not be here, and comrades and cohorts, and I certainly will do the same thing. I'm glad to see that USFSP is still active. I think it's an important organization to persevere with.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Grover,
Thank you
for coming tonight. Just due to time,
Yes.
normally we play "Wide Is My Motherland" at the end, but just due to time, I think we'll just end the presentation here.
Very good. Thank you.
So thank you so much for coming tonight, and thank you everyone for your
you for
questions
inviting. Yes.
and for the attention you gave Mr. Furr. So
Thank you
thank you
very
once again,
Right.
and I hope to see you again soon.
Yes. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good evening, everyone.
Good evening, everyone.
Good night.
Have a good night, all.